What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we dive into the multicolor cards of Murders at Karlov Manor. Compared to the monocolors of this set, there are quite a lot more of the multicolor cards, so this video will be quite long, as there are probably about double the amount of multicolor cards compared to any single one color. With that being said, let's just dive into the video and let's just start talking about the cards. The first card up is going to be Aegis Cost, the Spirit of Justice. This is a 4-mana 2/4 double strike vigilance creature. It is legendary. It is a spirit detective. Whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, you get to choose up to one target creature. You then suspect that creature. If the creature is already suspected, you then exile it. This is kind of a unique removal spell, I think, built into a creature. It's one of those things that the turn it comes out, you put a suspected thing on it, that creature now can't block. Though it does have menace, the following turn when you do decide to attack with this card, you will then get that trigger of being able to exile that card that maybe you don't have removal for in your hand. This is definitely going to be a very solid card, I think, in Limited. Double Strike is always very complicated to deal with. It can't be chump blocked very easily because they have to put a bunch of things in it that have enough toughness that it's going to last until that second attack step when they do the normal damage. So it is definitely going to be a hard card to deal with, I think, in that regard. Overall, it's definitely a unique card. It's definitely something that is very playable in Limited. It may be a little clunky, I think, for a standard format. 4 mana is quite expensive. Giving your opponent a menace creature for a turn could be kind of risky if you don't have enough blockers. Commander, this is probably going to be a card people will build around just because it's a legendary creature. Itself can be a commander. If not, it can probably go in any Boros-style deck, as I do think this is a pretty solid card in general just because it has that built-in removal, plus its other upside benefit of slowly exiling things from the battlefield makes it pretty playable in that regard. Other than that, definitely a cool card, definitely something I want to mess around with, see what I can do with it. With that being said, let's move on to the next card. The next card up is going to be Aliquist Prophet. Master Sleuth is a 3-mana 3/3 legendary creature, human detective, has vigilance. When it ETBs, you investigate, so you create a clue token. And at any point, if you have 1 white, double blue, and whatever you pay for X, you can sacrifice a clue and draw X cards and gain X life. I actually kind of like this card. This is going to be one of those cards you play out in a game, and this is going to be as the game grinds on. If you're someone who's playing like a blue-white control, this is kind of like one of those cards you want to have, as it has a built-in card draw effect. Also can stand up and play defense and also be able to attack when there's opportunities to get in for some damage. Definitely a cool card. It could be a little bit clunky, I would say, in like a standard format, but definitely playable in Limited because I do think that last effect is going to be very solid. When the game's going on, it's getting to that point where both players are really trying to find answers, having that built-in effect that you can pay X plus whatever mana you have plus the white in the double blue at any point. Gain a little bit of life, gain a little bit of card draw at the cost of sacrificing only one single clue. I definitely think is definitely playable. As for Commander, also I think it's definitely playable. A 3-mana Commander is always very good. I do think this effect is pretty solid. You build around this whole effect of either creating investigate tokens, making sure you have a little bit of a ramp in the sense of what you have out land-wise. Overall, pretty solid card. Like I said, it's probably going to be pretty solid in Limited, probably pretty solid in Commander. And maybe, see some play in some blue-white control style matchup that wants to kind of grind the game out and get to a point where you have a ton of mana and you want to invest into that secondary effect. Definitely not a bad card overall. The next card up is going to be Ansrag, the Quake Mole. This is kind of a card I feel like a lot of people are excited about just because of its overall background. It is a mole god. It is an 8/4, which is kind of good for 4. Whenever it becomes blocked, untap each creature you control. After this combat phase, there's an additional combat phase. And then for 7 mana, you can invest into it to make it have to be blocked each combat this turn if able. So basically, you force at some point during the game, if you get to that point, you force that block. This is definitely going to be a good card, I think, in Limited, just for the fact that, your opponent's not going to want to take this 8 points of damage because that's almost half their life total, which is going to result in either a chump block or at least a block on it that's going to kill it, but going to grant you that additional combat step to maybe take advantage and kind of push more damage into your opponent. 8/4 is a pretty solid body. Most creatures have to be quite big to actually really block it. In terms of, standard, is it a card that we'll see play? Maybe the Gruul deck, this is the top end card that they put in that deck to be aggressive. Maybe turn 4 they drop this and they kind of force an attack, or they somehow give this card haste in that regard. It's definitely not bad there. Definitely something you probably play 2 or 3 copies of. Nothing that you're going to really play a full set of in a constructed format like that. And then as for Commander, I'm sure people are going to want to play this as a Commander because they think it's probably a really cool ability. It being a Commander itself, it allows you to even be aggressive with it. You bring it out, the turn you attacking with it, even if it dies, you then put it in your command zone. Then you play it on turn 6. and then you also then redo this all over again, putting pressure on your opponents in that regard. Overall, pretty solid card. I definitely see this card seeing a ton of play. It's definitely going to be one of those bomb cards if you open this up. I do feel like if you build really well, you'll definitely have a good chance of winning as long as you have this card in your deck. Overall, really, really cool card. Definitely kind of cool that it is a mole god. So if you like moles, this is definitely a card for you. Next card up is Assassin's Trophy. This is a reprint. This is kind of an interesting kind of removal spell. It is kind of a good removal spell in the sense that it can target any permanent. Doesn't have to just target creatures. It can target planeswalkers, target lands. So it kind of hits everything. Downside to this card for it being 2 mana and being able to do that effect is that your opponent can search for a basic land card, so it is definitely kind of risky. Do you really want to give your opponent that one additional land? It is something that could target lands if you don't play like, Ghostly Prison type cards, like stuff that's going to destroy non-basics. I guess you play this in your limited if you really need that removal in green-black. If you're lacking a little bit of extra removal, you're probably going to play this just because it is a 2 mana removal spell. In terms of standard, I don't really know if this will see a ton of play just because of its downside of giving your opponents basics. Granted, if you get into certain matchups and your opponent doesn't have a ton of basics, maybe this is a sideboard card at best in like a more best of 3 style format, as you can bring this in as given a way to add some additional ways to put pressure on your opponent's board without having the worry of them being able to put a basic land on the battlefield that they have not shown you any basics in the first game that you probably play. And then as in Commander, this is a card that sees play here and there depending on the deck's type. It's not the worst thing sometimes giving your opponent that one additional land. It's kind of like sometimes seen as, hey, I may do this thing, but hey, you get a land out of it, so you can play some politics behind it. But overall, it's not a bad card. It's definitely kind of cool seeing it have a reprint. It makes sense that it's reprinted in this set, as this is a set based on like murders. So having a card that's kind of like a murder-esque card built into a removal is definitely kind of cool. It is also pretty decent at only being a 2-drop, so definitely something that is playable if you really want to give your opponent that benefit of actually getting that additional land. Following that, we have Aurelia, the Law Above. It's a 5-mana 4/4, Fly and Vigilance Haste. Whenever a player attacks with 3 or more creatures, you draw a card. Whenever a player attacks with 5 or more creatures, it deals 3 damage to each opponent, and you gain 3 life. This is also another interesting card. It's definitely a good card, I would say, in limited. Having a 5-mana 4/4 Fly and Vigilance Haster that can attack immediately when it enters the battlefield. Its other effects are actually going to be very good in multiplayer formats just because of having the effect of whenever a player attacks with 3, it doesn't have to be you. You get to draw a card, and then the secondary and the last effect there, if your opponent's like going to swing big, they have to think about, well, do I want to have myself and everyone else take 3 points of damage, and then you self gain 3 life. Overall, pretty solid card. It's also legendary, could be a commander. In terms of constructed, I'm not really sure if you're going to be able to trigger this ability a lot of times. 5 mana for a 4/4, it's nothing special in today's standard format. It's a little bit faster, and sometimes getting a 5 mana 4/4, sure, it can attack immediately. It's a little bit more tricky, I guess, to see if this really finds a home. Maybe this is a card you play one of or 2 of in a Boros-style deck. This is just another top-end creature to maybe you that additional card advantage as you start draining your hand. You don't really have too many things left in it. And I do think, that secondary effect of kind of lightning helix in your opponent in the process of putting a big attack in on your opponent is definitely something to consider as well. Overall, not a bad card. Definitely a good card in Limited, and definitely a good card in Commander. And it's still to see if this card will see some play here and there in terms of a constructed like standard format. After that, we have Blood Spatter Analysis. It's a 2-mana enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, we'll deal 3 damage to target creature an opponent controls. And then whenever 1 or more creatures die, we mill a card, we put a Bloodstain counter on it, and then sacrifice it if it has 5 or more Bloodstain counters. And when we do, we get to return target creature card from our graveyard to our hand. This is kind of a unique card. I would say it's definitely, pretty solid that it's a removal when it ETBs. So it is kind of like, let's shock something or lightning bolt something for 3 points of damage. And then I guess over the course of the game, if you have some sort of type of sack outlet, if you're playing like maybe like a Rakdos Sacrifice style deck, that secondary effect could come in handy as the game goes on. Downside is you do have to mill a card, so it is kind of like one of those things, sure, something may be sacrificed. You're filling up your graveyard to hopefully find something that you want to bring back as you get to the point of this having those 5 counters on it. But I do think this is definitely going to be a solid card, I would say, just for its initial ETB effect. It's definitely going to be something you're probably going to play if you open this up in your draft and or sealed. It is something that I could see some play here and there if you build like a sacrifice style deck in other formats like your standard and whatnot. I'm not sure if you're playing 4 copies of this because I do feel like that becomes a little bit redundant. I don't think you want to mill yourself that many times if you have multiple copies of this out on the battlefield. But in terms of Commander, this is definitely probably, if you're playing a Rakdos Sacrifice deck, you'll probably include this just because you like, hey, it's a initial spot removal, plus then I get something to return something back that I maybe got killed or I sacrificed, and now I have a little bit of recursion in the long run. Overall, definitely not a bad card. Definitely going to be a Commander, like card that will shine. Definitely a card that you'll play unlimited just for the fact that it is removal in general, even if you don't really care about that secondary effect. Overall, pretty cool card. Definitely something to keep an eye out for. After that, we have an uncommon here called Breakout. It is a 2-mana sorcery that we have to look at the top 6 cards of our library. We reveal a creature card from among them. If that card has mana value 2 or less, we may put that card on the battlefield, and it gains haste on end turn. If we didn't put the revealed card onto the battlefield this way, you can put it into your hand and put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. I like this card. This card has definitely a lot of flexibility. These colors really don't have a lot of ways of digging deeper into your deck, maybe finding that creature you're looking for depending on where you are in the game state. Early on, you can put some additional pressure onto the battlefield. Maybe you don't have a 2-drop. You play this on 2. You then find that 2-drop, which is definitely not that bad, and then be able to attack immediately in with it. If you get into late game, you then can find maybe one of your bigger drops by digging 6, hopefully finding maybe one of your 5, 6 drops or something like that. Overall, very solid card. Definitely going to be good in limited. In terms of constructed play, like standard and whatnot, I don't know if Gruul is really going to want to be doing this at 2. Typically, Gruul curves out fairly well. Typically, they have a decent 2-drop that they don't really need to be digging for other stuff. Though I would say if you're probably playing like Commander or something like that, this card could become pretty handy just because it is a singleton format. Being able to dig a little bit deeper into your deck is always going to be very good. Hoping to find more things to put on the battlefield or more things to play following turns. But overall, it's a very solid card. I would say definitely going to be the big highlight of Gruul for limited formats for the most part, and could see some fringe play here and there depending on what kind of deck you play in Standard and or Commander. The next card up is going to be Buried in the Garden. It's a 4-mana enchantment aura. You enchant a land when it ETBs. When it enters the battlefield, you exile target non-land permanent you don't control until it leaves the battlefield. And then when enchanted land is tapped for mana, its controller adds an additional mana of any one color. This card's pretty solid, I would say. It's definitely going to be a good removal spell to have in green-white when it comes to limited. As you get the added benefit here, besides exiling that card, now your land that you enchanted with this makes 2 mana instead of 1 mana, making you have a little bit of mana ramp in the process as well. In terms of other formats, I don't really know if this will see a ton of play. 4 mana is kind of expensive, even in the enchantment deck. Even if you get the discount of having it being 3 mana, maybe it sees some fringe play. Maybe you want that 1 additional mana. But I do think there's just much better enchantments at 3 that you get the discount on. They only become 2 mana enchantments. You also have Ossification in like a standard format that you probably want to play over this card in general. And then in terms of Commander, yet again, I do feel like a 4-mana enchantment aura land type thing is a little slow. I do think there's much better things. You probably have more access to other ramp spells, other removal spells that you definitely can play over this. But overall, in limited, this is definitely going to be one of those shine and staples type cards you'll play in these colors if you're looking for that type of removal. Definitely not a bad card to be looking out for when it comes to drafting and or in your sealed pool. The next card up is going to be Coursed to Kill. It is a 5-mana enchantment aura. You enchant a creature, you control the enchanted creature, and then that enchanted creature's base power and toughness becomes a 1/1. It gains death touch and now is an assassin in addition to its other types. This is kind of a cool card. It's a mind control-esque card. You now take your opponent's creature, you make it into a nice 1/1 death touch and blocker, or you make it into an attacker that gets 1 point of damage in. Your opponent's not going to want to really chump block their own creature. Losing 2 creatures in the process is definitely not something I'm sure your opponent really wants to do. I would say this is something you're going to target like a really good creature that your opponent's going to be like, oh man, you just took my creature. It's going to be like really kind of tilting in that regard. Definitely a cool card. Definitely going to be a solid removal-esque spell in limited just because, mind control cards are definitely always a good thing. And I do think the idea here, it does essentially become a removal spell because you are going to do something with this 1/1 creature because you don't want to ever give it back to your opponent to give them either their full-size creature back or you're going to end up chump blocking with it or something like that. But definitely a cool card. Definitely something to look out for in limited if you're in these colors, or you can even splash for it if you are either playing blue or black, just because I do think this is a pretty solid card to have as another cool top-end-esque effect. The next card up is going to be Crowd Control Warden. This is a 5-mana 4/4. When ETBs or is turned face up, put X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is the number of other creatures you control. You can turn it face down for 3 and turn it face up at any point for 5. This is actually a pretty solid card, I would say, for being a common. It is something that will probably come out greater power than what it is printed on the card. You're not going to want to play this into a board where you have nothing out because a 5-mana 4/4 by itself doesn't seem anything special. And I do like the flexibility. You could do it either way. You either just have it immediately come out as a big creature, or you put it face down, surprise your opponent by flipping it face up at the time when you decide to pay that 5 mana, turning your 4/4 maybe into a 6/6, 7/7, maybe get that a little bit of extra surprise damage that they're not expecting. Maybe they put their biggest creature in front of it, and it turns out this creature ends up trading with that creature and or removes the other creature from your opponent's side of the battlefield. Definitely a very solid card. Definitely a very good card if you're in green white for limited that you're going to want to pick up. In other formats, probably a little bit too slow, but definitely not a bad card. Definitely probably something if you're looking for maybe a little bit more budget-esque style deck. Could be something kind of top end, maybe for a token style deck, maybe in standard if you're able to build up other tokens. You have this come out as your top end on 5. Definitely not a bad card. Downside, it doesn't have really any trample or anything, so it is kind of one of those cards that is limited because you can't trample over your creatures, even if it's a big creature. But still a cool card. Definitely something that is going to be very solid for your limited draft and or sealed. Following it up, we have Curious Cadaver. It's a 4-mana 3/1 flyer that when we sacrifice a clue, we return it from our graveyard to our hand. This is an okay card, nothing really special. A 4-mana 3/1 flyer is pretty good. I don't think blue really have a ton of flyers, so having a card that kind of has recursion and also being a flyer is pretty decent. The set is going to be full of ways to investigate and get clues, so definitely going to have many outlets to get this back from the graveyard if it ends up being there. Downside to this, it only has 1 toughness, so any kind of creature can really block it in the air if they have some sort of blocker. So it is something to kind of look out for. So I would say it's an okay-ish card, maybe a filler card if you're looking for some additional evasive flyers or flying in your blue-black deck in your limited slash draft pool. In terms of other constructed formats, probably not going to really see any play. There's definitely better cards I'd rather be playing at 4 than this card. This is definitely just one of those cards that's going to be a good card in limited and not really shine anywhere else. Following that up, we have Deadly Complication. This is a 3-mana sorcery spell that we get to choose one or both. We destroy target creature. Already pretty solid. A 3-mana destroy target creature is very good in red-black. Or we get to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature we control. We may have it become suspected. If it is suspected, it is no longer suspected. So definitely kind of wordy in that sense. But overall, this is a pretty solid card. 3 mana, destroy 1 creature, buff your creature, either give it suspected or remove suspected from it, making it a pretty solid card overall. I think the only downside to this card is sorcery speed, so it is something you're going to be doing during your own main phase. So it is kind of like a face-up trick. It's not anything special. Like your opponent's going to see, oh, you're putting a +1/+1 counter on this creature. Okay, I understand now. But I do think the idea here is that you can also destroy a creature in the process, which for only 3 mana makes it a pretty powerful card in that sense. Definitely going to be a very solid card to have in your draft and or sealed if you're in Rakdos colors. In terms of other formats, there are just better cards, for removal in these colors. You play your burner spells as removal, or you play your cut downs, your go for the throat, stuff like that in the 2-drop and 1-drop slots, so you have much better removal in that regard. But still, nonetheless, is definitely not a bad card, I think, to look out for in your draft and or sealed. Following that, we have Detective Satchel. It's a 4-mana artifact. When it ETBs, we investigate twice, so we create 2 clue tokens for 4 mana. And we tap it, create a 1/1 Thopter artifact creature token with flying. We can only activate its ability, though, if we sacrifice an artifact. So basically, it creates artifacts that we can tap to sacrifice to draw a card and also then create a Thopter. There are other avenues I've seen in red where you definitely have some ways of sacrificing artifacts more for a cheaper cost. I think there's a few ways in blue as well that you can also have ways of sacrificing your clues maybe for cheaper or just using the artifacts to sacrifice for another effect. So it's definitely not a bad card to have. Definitely kind of interesting to see how well this will perform in draft and sealed. In other formats, I think 4 mana is a little bit slow. It doesn't really have a lot of good other upside in the sense of it is going to take some time for you to put it out on the battlefield and then be able to use it, because typically you're going to probably be tapping out completely for this because it does cost 4 mana. You're not really going to be playing this on turn 6 when you have where your best move is going to be play this, investigate, sacrifice one of your clues to draw a card, and then make a 1/1 Thopter. That doesn't really seem like a very good, effective play, I would say, overall. But in terms of limited, this is definitely not a bad card to have just because it creates ways of drawing additional cards. It also creates ways of putting board presence on the battlefield. So that's actually where this card probably will shine the most. And then, like Commander, for example, maybe this is a one-off that you're really invested into clues. Maybe you have a lot of ways to sacrifice in artifacts. You do have options of if you do have treasure tokens. This is definitely going to be a card that can be going off quite frequently as long as you sacrifice a treasure, which generates a mana. Definitely another good way to kind of get the tap effect to really go off. And I guess really thinking about it, if you could build around treasures and clues, maybe in blue-red in like a more constructed format, maybe this card will see like a 1 or 2 of in a deck if that's kind of the style of the deck. And maybe don't really worry about sacrificing the clues. You have other free options of sacrificing to kind of get that ability to kind of go off. But still, nonetheless, kind of a cool card. Definitely going to be a card that's going to shine in limited just because it has built-in card draw because it puts clues on the battlefield, and it also has that built-in token generation when you do sacrifice your artifacts. After that, we have Dog Walker. It's a 2-mana 3/1 Vigilance. It also has Disguise, so we can put it face down for 3, flip it at any point for either double red, double white, or a red and white mixture. And when it is turned face up, you create 2 tapped 1/1 dog creature tokens. So another card that's kind of unique in that regard. It is something that you can invest, in theory, 5 mana for. You get 3 creatures out of it. Downside, I think, to it is a 3/1, so it's definitely very easily chumpable. It does have Vigilance, which makes it a very decent attack, a very good attacker, I should say. But still, nonetheless, it's a very okay-ish card. I feel like, if anything, if you're playing Boros, you're more than likely going to just play this as a 2-drop. You're not really going to invest that mana to really flip it over. I don't really know, unless you've got like Aurelia that you really care about having additional things on the battlefield to get triggers from Aurelia, that this card will really see a ton of way people fit into face down to turn to face up, because you're not really surprising yourself being like, oh man, instead of having a 2/2, I have a 3/1. It's not like it's anything that crazy. But nonetheless, definitely a cool card. Definitely something that's kind of a 2-drop filler in Boros. Definitely something to look out for if you're looking for that kind of filler card. In other formats, there's just much better things in the 2-drop slot that you're probably playing those over this. So definitely a card that's going to be a filler card in Limited, but not really played in other formats. Following that, we have Doppelgang. This is a XXX blue-green spell. For each time we paid for X, we target X permanents. We then create X tokens that are copies of those permanents. So basically, if you invest 5 mana into this, which is paying 1 for each X, you're gonna target 1 permanent. You're gonna create 1 copy. If you have 8 mana, you target 2 permanents and create 2 copies of each permanent. This is going to be one of those kind of like awkward cards, I would say, in Limited, just because you're really not probably going to take advantage of paying a ton of mana to really invest into it. In more of constructed, like standard type format, I think this is probably a little bit too expensive, unless you're trying to do some crazy shenanigans and you're trying to build around this. This is definitely one of those cards that will be very niche and find homes in very fringe style decks. And then in Commander, I'm sure this is a card people will play, just because in these colors in Commander, there are many ways to ramp up mana, get a ton of mana that you can invest a ton into this to get the full effect. Creating copies of X permanents, whether they're lands, whether they're creatures, is definitely very powerful. And I do think this is one of those cards that will shine in a Commander-esque format, not really in most other formats, just because of how expensive it will be, as you have to invest a ton really to get a big full effect out of this. Next up, we have a card that has quite a bit of text, and that is Drag the Canal. This is a 2-mana instant speed spell. We create a 2/2 blue-white detective creature token, and then if a creature died this turn, we gain 2 life, we surveil 2, and then we investigate. So basically, this is going to be kind of more of a reactionary card. This is not going to be a card you're going to catch your opponent off guard by playing this at instant speed during combat. You're going to play this after combat resolve. Something may have died on the battlefield, but then you get to get all these other additional effects for it. I guess at worst, you get a 2/2, and that's about it. But really, what you're going to want to do is target that other effects of it. The creature died this turn, you get the 2 life, you get to surveil, and then you also get to investigate. I think this is where this card shines. Definitely a card that's going to see play when you do open it up in your draft and or sealed. Maybe see some fringe play if a blue-black deck is looking for this esque effect. If it's looking for the idea here that you're going to get a token, you are going to also get a bunch of other things. I guess maybe if blue-black control is a thing, maybe this is a card that deck kind of plays, because it does have spot removal. And then typically we'll have room to actually also be able to probably cast this on top of that. And then in Commander, this is probably a card people will also play, just because it is kind of a very unique card. It is something, if you're in these colors, maybe this is just another kind of decent spell that you can actually cast. These colors in typically Commander formats really care about maybe putting things in the graveyard. Surveil 2 is not bad. Being able to also investigate is also pretty solid. But nonetheless, this is actually not a bad card, I think, at 2 mana in general, if you do find a home in other formats, and definitely a card you'll play in Limited. Next up is Atrada, Deadly Fugitive. This is a 3-mana 1/4 Death Toucher. Face down creatures you control have tap 4, a blue and a black. Turn this creature face up. If you can't exile it, you then may cast the exile card without paying its mana cost, and whenever an assassin you control deals combat damage to an opponent, cloak the top card of that player's library. So this is kind of like that card that is, I want to build around taking my opponent's things and not really playing my deck. This is going to be a way of cloaking your opponent's cards. You then can either turn those cards face up, which is definitely not that bad for that 4 mana, or worst case scenario, you get to cast their spells. This is definitely not bad in that sense. I do think this is kind of a cool card. It's not really anything super powerful in the sense of like, hey, I open this up in my draft and they're sealed. I'm going to take the game over by doing this. It does take a little bit of maneuvering, finding avenues to really get in points of damage against your opponent. Though this is going to be one of those cards people will build around in Commander, I would say, just because this card in itself is definitely going to be, people love building decks where they play opponent's decks. This this is going to be that card that helps enable that, and you then play it as a commander. You now have access to blue and black spells that will also help you play your opponent's decks. But overall, definitely a cool card. Definitely, like I said, built around more so for, I think, that multiplayer-esque style of gameplay. But if you do put this out on the battlefield, even in your drafts, indoor sealed, you probably will still have some decent plays with it, just because you are going to be taking your opponent's things if you are able to manage and get any additional points of damage in. More than likely, you won't ever attack with this unless you have a decent opportunity that this is not going to get killed in the process of combat. You're going to find avenues of having your other creatures actually attack in for damage, and then being able to then trigger the secondary effect of it, making this card overall pretty solid. After that, we have Evidence Examiner. It's a 2-mana 2/2. At the beginning of our combat during our turn, we may collect evidence 4. So if we have, mana value 4 or greater in our graveyard, we can exile up to 4 or greater. And then whenever we collect evidence, we investigate. So this is kind of like a artifact enabler. This is going to be a way to generate artifact tokens on the battlefield. If you are in a deck that matters and wants to get artifacts on the battlefield and you don't really have any other ways to investigate, this is definitely not that bad in that sense. I'm still not really sold on this whole evidence collection thing, just because in a lot of instances, you may not have things early game really to take advantage of that effect. And as the game goes on, are there cards that you really want to exile just in case you have any sort of recursion from your graveyard? Is that something you're going to want to do? But definitely not a bad card. It's kind of at worst, it's a 2/2 Grizzly Bear-esque card. It's going to be a card that you'll play as a 2-drop in your limited drafts and sealed. Probably not going to see a ton of play in other formats unless a deck pops up that really worries about, getting artifacts, collecting evidence, and being able to put things into the graveyard. But nonetheless, definitely a good card to look out for, I guess, if you're looking to, have some decent 2-drop in your draft and sealed. The next card up is going to be Isrim, Agency Chief. It's a 5-mana 5/5 flyer that when it ETBs, we investigate twice, so we get 2 clue tokens. And then for 1 mana, we can sacrifice an artifact. It give it hexproof, flying, lifelink until end of turn. This is definitely a very solid card. This is a very good card. I would say this is a pack 1, pick 1 type card, just because it has very good top end in the sense that it kind of enters the battlefield, and then your opponent has to figure out how to really deal with this. Typically, you're not going to want to play this with no open mana afterwards, just because you're going to want to leave that 1 mana open just to give it hexproof in case your opponent has a sort of spot removal spell. But still, nonetheless, this card's very solid. 5/5 for 5 is very good. It has flying. It's definitely going to shine in limited. In terms of constructed play, like in standard and whatnot, it is something that is a little bit expensive. It is something that I would say maybe sees 1 or 2 copies in maybe a more control-in deck that's really trying to grind the game out, as you can use this card to be kind of that aggressive card to maybe finish off your opponent as you kind of take control of the game. Then in terms of commander, maybe this is a blue-white commander type card where you're wanting to investigate, create a bunch of clue tokens. Maybe have other ways of being able to generate other artifacts to be able to keep on sacrificing to this. That is going to be one of those things, keeping the artifacts out on the battlefield to keep on having that 1 mana available to protect your card in general. But for the most part, this is definitely going to be a good card to have in your limited draft and sealed. But overall, I kind of like this card for the most part, what it's trying to do. Then we have Fairy Snoop. It's a 3-mana 1/4, has flying, also has disguise. When it is turned face up, you look at the top 2 cards of your library, put one into your hand and the other into your graveyard. It's not a bad card. It's not a great card. 1/4 for 3 is okay. Doing the disguise effect is definitely not bad in the sense if you're looking for an answer or looking for more pressure on your opponent, definitely putting the face down to turn the face up eventually is always very good. I do think that's pretty good. But once it turns face up, it's only a 1/4 flyer, which makes it pretty much a blocker and only pings for 1 point of damage here and there, which doesn't really whittle your opponent down a ton. But it definitely can be effective if your opponent doesn't really have a lot of ways to really deal with flying creatures. Definitely not a bad card to have. I would say this is mostly a filler card, mostly a card if you're looking for some ways to gain additional card advantage. It's going to be a card you're going to be playing in that regard. But for the most part, it's a pretty decent filler card, I would say, for limited. The next card up is going to be Gleeman Geardrake. This is a 2-mana 1/1 flyer that when it enters the battlefield, you investigate. And then whenever we sacrifice an artifact, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on Gleeman Geardrake. So this is one of those cards that starts off very small, but over the course of the game, if you have avenues of generating clue tokens, continue to sacrifice those clue tokens to get some card advantage. This card is going to grow and become a problem for your opponent. Definitely a cool card. Definitely something that looks to using these artifacts that you're generating in these colors. Overall, very solid card. Definitely very good in blue-red, as there are many ways to investigate, many ways of getting clues, many ways of having free avenues to sacrifice said clues. Definitely a good card. Definitely something I would definitely play. It is something that could be on the fringe of pack 1, pick 1, depending on if you really want to go into this idea. In terms of other formats, If a deck pops up that's all about, generating clue tokens or generating ways of sacrificing artifacts, this could become a pretty solid card in that regard. In other formats, there are easier ways to create treasures. Treasures are free ways of sacrificing artifacts, so definitely something that can be played along with a deck that's trying to generate treasures. And then this will grow in that process. Maybe there's like a blue-red Pirates deck that wants to play this Drake on top of the Pirates. And then in terms of Commander, yet again, there are decks that are focused around artifacts. Maybe there's a lot of decks that have ways of sacrificing artifacts that you can play for free. Like, you got things like Mishra's Bauble, stuff like that. You get that artifact out, you're going to probably immediately sacrifice it, then immediately grow this. I think the only downside to this card, it doesn't have haste, so it's not something that can be super aggressive if you're able to sacrifice artifacts immediately as this comes out. Other than that, this is definitely a very solid card, I think, from top to bottom, just being a 2-mana 1/1 that grows eventually over the course of the game. And becoming a problem for your opponent is going to be very good, I think, overall with this card. Following that up, we have Granite Witness. This is a flying vigilance creature, a 3/2. Has disguise of 2, and then when it's turned face up, you may tap or untap target creature. Yet again, it's a very solid card. It's a good block. It's a good flyer. It's a good attacker because as vigilance, you can stay back on defense. Maybe turn off your opponent's flyer from really attacking in. I do think the effect of flipping it up at some point, if you're really lacking removal, being able to flip something up to tap something or untap something can be very good as well. Overall, not a bad card. It's definitely something that's more of a filler card. It's a 4-mana card, kind of expensive. But I do think the upside of having Flying and Vigilance makes this card very, very playable and definitely more on I'm probably going to include this in my list if I'm playing blue-white in my draft in sealed. But in terms of other formats, probably a little bit too expensive. Not good enough to really see a home in other decks just because 4 mana, you want to be doing other stuff. And that's probably a little bit better overall than just flipping this card face up or even playing it for 4 mana to get a 3/2. The next card up is going to be Ill-Time Explosion. It's a 4-mana sorcery that we get to draw 2 cards, and then we may discard 2 cards. When we do, Ill-Time Explosion deals X damage to each creature where X is the greatest mana value among the cards discarded this way. This is kind of an interesting card, right? At worst, it's just a 4-mana draw 2. With no downside in the sense that you don't have to discard any of that. It's a little bit slow in that regard if you're looking just to do that effect. But I do like the upside here of that you can discard 2 cards or up to 2 cards and actually deal X damage based on the highest mana value of said discarded cards. So I think in terms of limited, this is definitely going to be a card that you're going to want to play in these colors if you're playing these colors, just because having a way to kind of wipe the board if your opponent's going to try to get very wide on you, being able to even do 2 or 3 points of damage across the battlefield could, balance the battlefield a little bit better if they have a lot of small creatures. And at worst, like I said, it's going to draw you 2 cards. In terms of playing this card in other formats, maybe in a standard deck where you're playing big spells, maybe you want spells to go into the graveyard. Maybe you're looking to play like an Arcane Bombardment style deck. This is actually not a bad card to have in that regard, just because you are probably trying to dump cards into your graveyard. And then being able to discard those bigger cards to put under for Arcane Bombardment could be very good. And then, like I said, in terms of Commander, this is definitely gonna be a card people will play if they're playing. It's a deck that will probably try to go big because it's trying to put spells in the graveyard, probably very expensive spells in the graveyard. So this is just gonna be an enabler for that style of deck. But overall, it's a pretty cool card. Definitely gonna be a good removal card for limited, just because there aren't many ways of dealing with board presence in blue and red in this set. But definitely a way of that's putting the rebalance in the battlefield if it feels like it's getting out of hand. The next card up is going to be Insidious Roots. It's a 2-mana enchantment that creature tokens you have tap, add 1 mana of any color. And then whenever one or more creature cards leave your graveyard, create a 0/1 plant creature token, then put a +1/+1 counter on each plant you control. In limited, it may be a little clunky. I don't really know how many avenues there are outside of collecting evidence that you have to generate plant tokens to kind of get that additional effect in green and black, but definitely not bad in that regard. Having ways of fixing your mana for only 2 mana is definitely not bad if you have other ways of generating tokens. In terms of other formats, this is definitely probably not going to be that bad, as there are decks that can generate a bunch of creature tokens. Not really sure if there's a ton in green and black in like a standard format, but in terms of Commander, this is definitely going to be a good card, as there are many decks that generate tokens in green black. Have many ways of generating creatures that come back from the graveyard. So definitely going to be probably a very good card, I would say, in that format overall. Definitely a cool card. Definitely something I could see messing around with in more of a Commander-esque brawl effect. Maybe see if there's some deck that could really focus on this effect in maybe more of a standard constructed format. And then as for limited, it's probably not a bad card to have if you have ways of generating creature tokens or have ways of generating things to leave the graveyard by playing some cards that are collecting evidence and getting rid of maybe a creature or two in that process, and then eventually creating this plant army that just overwhelms your opponent as the game goes on. Following that, we have Izani, Center of the Web. It's a 6 mana 5/4 with Menace. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, you may collect evidence 4. If we do, we create 2/2/1 black-green spider creature tokens with Menace and Reach, and then sacrifice 4 tokens. We surveil 2, then draw 2 cards and lose 2 life. This is definitely a very solid top-end card, I would say, in green-black. Going over the last card, this is actually a good card to have with that last card, because if you think about it, this has a way to enable that whole moving things from the graveyard. So as long as we have converted mana cost 4 or greater in the graveyard at any given time whenever this enters the battlefield and or attacks, we create 2 tokens. We then create a plant creature token. We are then going to get that plant creature token a +1/+1 counter. And then we have this avenue as well. If we're looking for some answers, we can surveil 2, draw 2 cards, and gain 2 life. Sure, in the process, we will lose our creature tokens we're generating here, but then we're going to gain a whole bunch of ways of kind of getting card advantage, and having the surveil 2 allows us to kind of refill the graveyard back up to enabling us to have the way of allowing us to make more tokens in general. So kind of has that decent loop. I think this overall is a pretty solid card for limited. Definitely not bad, for 6 mana. Menace is always very good. It can also block. It generates tokens, which puts pressure on the battlefield in general. They also have Reach, which makes it harder for your opponent to attack you in the air. And they also have Menace, which is also pretty solid. And then in terms of, like other formats, Standard's probably a little too expensive. Just because, 6 mana is a lot. It's a 5/4. It doesn't really do too much, maybe immediately when it comes out, that really turns the tide of battle in your favor. In terms of Commander, this is probably a card that's going to be played in green-black. A lot of decks generate tokens. I kind of said it about the last card. This is just another card that helps you enable token generation. Those colors can have ways of putting cards into the graveyard that you can, use and collect evidence for to get more tokens. Definitely not bad overall. I think having the ability that you sacrifice 4 tokens, avail 2, then draw 2 cards and gain 2 life is actually not bad either. Overall, very solid card. Definitely going to be I think it's going to shine the most, I think, in limited, just because it is going to be a hard card to deal with. It puts a lot of pressure on the battlefield when it ETBs. Definitely not a bad card, I guess, to play if you're playing green-black in limited. Following that, we have Judith, Carnage Connoisseur. It's a 5 mana 3/4. Whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell, we get to choose one. That spell gains Death Touch and Lifelink, and then we create a 2/2 red imp creature token. When this creature dies, it deals 2 damage to each opponent. This one's kind of unique, I would say. Overall, it's definitely not a bad card to have, I think, in limited, just because I do think that effect, if you're able to actually take advantage of it even a couple of times, is definitely very good. The idea here that it gives any spell Death Touch and Lifelink, it kind of essentially turns that spell into almost like a Lightning Helix-esque effect, right? Even if it's a deal 1 damage to target creature, in theory, it's deal 1 damage with Death Touch, so that creature's going to die. You're then going to gain 1 life. Definitely makes that spell very solid. Also, having the idea here that you can start creating a little bit of an imp army if there's not much really to target here, is definitely going to be pretty solid as well. And then when those imps eventually do die, they're going to do 2 damage to each opponent. So this is going to be one of those cards that we'll see a ton of play, I think, in multiplayer formats, just because of that secondary effect as well. Overall, very solid card. I do think this is yet again another card that helps turn your spells into much better spells. Let's just say, for example, you don't really get any good top-end removal spells in red. Like, you don't have the bigger burn cards where they deal more damage. You only have things like shock and stuff like that. It turns your shock into a much better shock, which then can target a bunch of things. So definitely good in that regard. In terms of constructed, like standard and whatnot, I don't really know. 3/4 for 5 is a little clunky. Typically you want this to be able to then be you want to cast a spell immediately after to take any advantage of this before it leaves the battlefield. In terms of commander, either people will play this as a commander or they'll play this in maybe their Rakdos deck that's maybe more focused on casting spells on top of doing other things. So definitely not a bad card, I would say, mostly for commander, mostly for limited, and then maybe some fringe play here and there in more of a constructed format as maybe a one-off, if anything, at most. The next card up is our first Planeswalker that I've gone over so far from this set. It's Kaya's Spirit's Justice. It's a 4-mana Planeswalker that has the static effect that whenever one or more creatures we control and or creatures cards in our graveyard are put into exile, we may choose a token we control until end of turn that target token becomes a copy of it, except it has flying. So definitely a very interesting static effect. It has ways of taking it, using that effect on its own. For +2, you can surveil 2, then exile a card from your graveyard. So in theory, you can exile a creature from your graveyard. You can put a creature from the surveil into your graveyard to then exile. It does also have a +1 if you don't have a ton of tokens. It generates a token with the +1. It creates a 1/1 black-white spirit creature token with flying. And then it also has a -2 effect that you exile a creature you control. You exile also For each other player, you also exile up to one target creature that player controls. So definitely unique in that sense. Definitely kind of a okay-ish Planeswalker. I'm not really blown away by it. There are stuff in Orzhov that you can play alongside of this, like Wet Announcement in like Constructed Standard, that you can generate a bunch of tokens, so you don't actually have to immediately +1 when it comes out and take advantage of that maybe +2 or -2. In terms of limited, it's definitely not a bad card to have either. Has built-in removal, has built-in ways of taking advantage of things in your graveyard, so if things end up in the graveyard by dying, you can always do one of these effects to kind of exile that, make your token into something that's a little bit stronger, get some additional points of damage in. In terms of, like, Commander, I feel like it's always up in the air whether or not people play Planeswalkers. Typically, if you're playing Planeswalkers, the decks really focus around Planeswalkers. And then typically you don't play a ton of other creatures, so definitely kind of unique in that sense. But overall, I would say this is definitely going to be not a bad card to have in your limited drafts and sealed. Definitely going to probably see decks probably pop up playing this card if they're playing more token-focused things like Wedding Announcements and things like that. But overall, it's not a bad card. Definitely a pretty decent card, I would say. Definitely something that you're probably playing a couple copies of in constructed formats. Like Standard, and definitely a card you're going to be playing if you open it up and or draft it in your drafts and sealed. The next card up is going to be Kellen, Inquisitive Prodigy. It's a 4-mana creature. It also has a Venture spell built into it, so it's kind of another card that has a Venture. Tail of the Suspect. It's a 2-mana green-blue spell, sorcery. You investigate, and then you get to play an additional land, so it has kind of built-in mana ramp, which is pretty solid as long as you have that additional land in your hand. You are then able to play that additional land on that side, so on turn 2, you can then have 3 mana, so then you're maybe 2 lands up or 1 land up on your opponent. And then when you play the creature side, it does have flying, it does have vigilance, which is pretty good in general. And then whenever it attacks, destroy up to 1 target artifact. If we control that artifact or that permanent, we get to draw a card. So you maybe will destroy the clue you make with it. Maybe your opponent has an artifact that you don't really want out on their side of the battlefield. So basically, this is a way to kind of eliminate their artifact. Overall, pretty solid card. Definitely a very good top end card. In your limited and draft. Maybe we'll see some play in like Standard and other formats. I'm not really sure, just because it is a little bit slow, but it does have some decent mana ramp possibilities. It is a human fairy detective, so maybe there's a deck that can find a home with something like this. Green-blue, though, I'm not really sure is super popular. And then in terms of Commander, it's an okay-ish card. Yet again, maybe there's some other maybe there's decks that want to play this style of deck. I don't really know, but I do think it's a pretty, flexible card because it has the Adventure spell on top of it being also a creature spell. The next card up is going to be Kraul, Whipcracker. It's a 2-mana 3/2 with reach. When it ETBs, you destroy a target token an opponent controls. This card's actually pretty good, I would say, for limited, just because 2-mana 3/2 is pretty strong, power-wise. On top of that, the creature has reach, meaning it can block very well in the air. And I do think the idea here that a lot of people are going to be probably investigating one way or the other, being able to destroy their clues before they can crack them to draw a card is going to be very good. There are some ways of generating additional copies of said cards, so being able to destroy a copy of a card is always good in that sense. Definitely not a bad card to have. Definitely something I'm playing just as a very good 2-drop in a green-black deck for limited. In terms of other formats, probably not going to see a ton of play just because I don't think this effect is very good in other formats, just because typically when people can generate tokens, they don't just generate one token, they generate many tokens, and destroying one of them is not really going to do too much to deter them from really generating more additional tokens after that. So basically going to be a very good, very strong 2-drop if you are playing limited. Following that up, we have Kylox, Visionary Inventor. It's a 7-mana 4/4, has Menace, has Ward, has Haste. Has a lot of good effects. Does cost 7, so off the bat kind of like has to have a good effect to kind of really blow me away. Whenever it attacks, you sacrifice any number of other creatures, then exile top X cards of your library. X is the total power. You may cast any number of instances and sorcery spells from among the exiled cards without paying their mana costs. This is kind of like an okay-ish card, I would say, for limited. It's not something I'm gonna like really probably take full advantage of, just because it is kind of, it's kind of, it's not anything that's crazy. Menace, Ward, and Haste is really good, so you're gonna put it down. You're gonna really attack him with it. It can't really be removed very easily because they have to pay additional 2. It is also a 4/4, so typically your bigger removal spells do cost additional to really deal with a 4/4. So it is something that you maybe get to cast a few spells off top of your library. In limited, you may not have a ton of big top-end spells that you're really going to take advantage of this card. I would say the format this card's going to shine the most in is going to be something like a Commander. It's not going to probably be a Commander because 7 mana is quite expensive, but it is going to be a card that you could probably include in like an Is-It list, because the minute this comes down, you're probably going to sacrifice as many things as possible just to kind of see what you flip off the top of your library and play a bunch of like free spells, which is definitely kind of cool in that sense. In terms of constructed, like Standard and stuff like that, too slow. 7 mana is a lot. I mean, unless you can figure out how to ramp to 7 as quickly as possible in blue-red, it's not going to really see a ton of play that way. And then in like limited, like I said, really it's just going to be a very expensive 4/4 Menace Ward Haste, just because you're not going to have a lot of good top-end spells really probably take full advantage of sacrifice and stuff. So, no, not bad that way, but not really anything special, I would say. Very expensive, very, very mana-intense card. Maybe, like I said, maybe sees playing Commander. 7 is a lot of mana in general just to kind of get like this effect that you have to have other things happening. On top of that, when you do decide to actually physically swing in with this. The next card up is going to be Kylox's Volt Strider. It's a 3 mana 4/4. We collect Evidence 6. It becomes an artifact creature in a turn. We can also crew for 2 if we just want to enable it as quickly as possible to be an attacker if we need it as a blocker and physical attacker. Though the upside here is when we collect Evidence 6, it has a secondary effect that whenever it attacks, we may cast an instant or sorcery spell from among the cards exiled with it, meaning that any cards you collect evidence with go underneath it, essentially, and then they're able to be cast at any point whenever it attacks. So even if you crew it in the future after collecting evidence 6 initially, every time you attack with it, you will then get you get the trigger, which then casts those spells. And then if that spell we put into a graveyard, put it into the bottom of its owner's library instead. So if any spell that you may have exiled with it is put underneath it, that card goes back into your graveyard. You have a chance of recasting it later in the game. Overall, this is a very strong card. I think this card's going to be very good in like limited, just because having vehicles in general are pretty solid. Having ways of casting spells for free if they end up in the graveyard at any point is going to be very good as well. It having the secondary ability to crew for 2 is also very good, just because this allows you to attack him for some decent damage. This is definitely going to be a card that shines, I think, in like Commander, in a Is It Spellslinger deck, a deck that's trying to put spells into the graveyard, maybe try to figure out ways of recasting those spells from the graveyard. This is going to be a card that you're going to want to be playing alongside of that, just because this is going to allow you to really enable you to cast maybe more expensive spells maybe much earlier in the game. Definitely a cool card, definitely a big fan of it. I do like this kind of card. This is definitely going to be a very powerful card. In terms of standard, maybe see some play here and there. It is something that takes a little bit of investment. Is playing this on turn 3 and collected evidence going to actually happen on turn 3? I don't really know, but I do think it's something that is on the battlefield in blue and red. This is something you're going to want to probably have a copy or two in your blue-red deck that's focused on spells, maybe. But overall, not a bad card. Definitely a good card, I would say, to look out for, just because it has flexibility in other formats. Following that up, we have Lazav, Wearer of Faces. It's a 2 mana 2/3. When it attacks, exile target card from a graveyard, then investigate. Whenever you sacrifice a clue, you may have Lazav become a copy of a creature that has been exiled with it. This is kind of another cool card. It is something that is probably more of a commander card, I would say, overall. It's not a bad card to have in like more of a limited format, just because a 2 mana 2/3 is always very solid. You can slowly exile things from your opponent's graveyard every time it attacks. Downside, it doesn't really have any sort of evasiveness, so it's not like something you can get in with Death Touch or something you can get in with Menace. It is going to be finding avenues of being able to give this thing either unblockable or being able to deal with your opponent's things that would normally try to block it as the game goes on. But definitely not a bad card, I would say, as you kind of power it up. Every time you sacrifice a clue, this now becomes whatever you exiled with it, which is definitely pretty sweet. Overall, very solid card. Definitely a card that I'm going to say we'll see a ton of play in limited, but probably not any real play anywhere else. The next card up on this list is going to be Leyline of the Guild Pact. This is a 4 mana Leyline card that's with this set. It does have a lot of different mana pips in the casting cost, so it is quite flexible depending on what colors you are. One of the most notable colors that really stand out in the colors is going to be that it's a focus really on green, and then you can splash the other colors to really cast it. The one good thing about this card, if it's in your opening hand, you get to start the game with it on the battlefield. Each non-land permanent you control is all colors, and lands you control are every basic land type in addition to the other types. So it is basically one of those cards that enables playing all colors if that's something you're looking to get into. In terms of limited, this is kind of an awkward card. It's a little bit hard to cast, I would say, just because of its many mana pips. It's not something you're going to be really looking for in that open hand consistently, just because it doesn't always happen that way. So typically, I would probably try to avoid this card. I probably wouldn't even pick it in my drafts. Maybe if I'm really trying to splash a bunch of colors, I would consider it in the deck if I do open it, maybe in my sealed. This is probably going to be only a card that shines maybe in Commander. I don't know if this is a card that you're going to be playing in like your Leyline decks and stuff like that in Standard. But I guess it helps enable Domain a little bit more effectively. But still, it's not bad at 4 mana. It's definitely something that can be played out. It's kind of a Chromatic Lantern built into an enchantment. Overall, it's an okay-ish card. Not something I'm like super sold on, but definitely something to consider if you are someone who's trying to play 5 colors. But overall, not a bad card. But it's not really a great card as well. Following that up, we have Lightning Helix. This is also a reprint. This is actually a really good reprint, I think, overall. It is a red and a white. It deals 3 damage to any target, and you gain 3 life. This is definitely a very, very strong card. It's definitely a card I'm playing in my drafts and sealed if I do see it, if I'm playing these colors. It is something that we'll probably see play in standard just because I think 2 mana to deal 3 damage and gain 3 life is very strong as well. And, you know, in terms of commander, this is not really a card that's really sees a ton of play. It sees maybe some fringe play here and there in Boros decks, but definitely a card that will see a ton of play in more constructed formats as well as, you know, limited for that spot removal and or damage to your opponent's face. And also the effect of that it gains you life. So overall, very, very good card. Definitely something to look out for when opening cards in drafts. Also something to probably put in any Boros deck that's looking for that additional removal. This is definitely a good card to look out for in that 2 mana slot. The next card up is going to be Meddling Youths. This is a 5 mana 4/5. It has haste. Whenever you attack with 3 or more creatures, you investigate. This is kind of like the Scooby-Doo card because it's the Meddling Youths. You know, it's the Scooby Gang. But definitely kind of a cool card. It is a 5 mana 4/5 with haste. It is something that's going to want you to enable by attacking with 3 things. If you have things like Aurelia, stuff like that, this is definitely not a bad card to be looking out for to add in as well. Definitely not a bad 5-drop. Definitely very good in the sense that it's 5 mana. You can attack it with it immediately. So definitely something that you played on turn 5, maybe with other attackers, and you immediately attack with 3 or more creatures, and then you get to trigger the investigate trigger. Definitely, like I said, not a bad card to be playing in limited. In terms of other formats, probably not played a ton, but definitely something to keep an eye out for when you're doing drafts and sealed. The next card we have is going to be Niv Mizzet Guild Pack. We have another Niv Mizzet sight-in. This one is a 5 mana 6/6 dragon that has flying and protection from multicolored. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, it deals X damage to any target. Target player draws X cards, and you gain X life for X's number of different color pairs among permanents you control that are exactly 2 colors. This is a very awkward card, I would say, for limited. It's probably, if anything, really just a card for commander. It's a 5 mana commander. It's a dragon commander if you want to play 5 colors. Its effect is okay. It is something that wants you to care about, you know, double color pips, I guess, overall, but nothing that's super crazy, super broken. And more than likely, it's going to feel really clunky in your limited pool because you're going to have to play all 5 colors. And if you don't have very good color fixing, you're not really going to be able to consistently cast this. And then in terms of, you know, standard and other constructed formats, I don't think, you know, investing into a 5-color deck, this is going to be what you want to have at your top end because you have to have that secondary effect to really take advantage of what Niv Mizzet does for it whenever it deals damage to an opponent. But overall, it's a very interesting Niv Mizzet. Definitely going to be interesting to see what people do with it when it comes of deck building in terms of commander. But overall, it's not really a good limited card, not really probably a good constructed card, and more than likely we'll see some play here and there in commander. Here we have another counter spell. This is No More Lies. This is a 2 mana counter spell unless its controller pays 3. If a spell was countered this way, you exile it instead of putting it into its owner's graveyard. I actually think this is a very solid counter spell. It's like Mana Leak. If you don't know what Mana Leak is a 2 mana counter spell, a colorless and a blue that just counters target spell for unless your opponent pays 3. I think this card's much better because that card doesn't actually go to the graveyard. It now gets exiled, so there's no way for your opponent to ever get that card back if you do decide to count it. It also targets any spell. It's not just creature spells. It's not just non-creature spells. This can target any spell. And typically, a lot of your opponents aren't really thinking that you're going to have a counter spell at 2 mana, or typically don't have that 3 mana open, which makes it pretty effective that way. The only downside I see to this is you're kind of invested into at least playing blue and white with this, just because you need to have both colors in order to actually cast it. But all in all, this is a very strong counter spell. This is something if you are in blue and white, even in limited or constructed or in commander, you're probably going to have at least 1 copy of this in any of those decks. Probably in constructed, you'll probably have more copies just because you'll probably be playing like blue-white control. And this is definitely probably a very good counter spell to have. Maybe even better than maybe a Make Disappear, just because you don't have to have a creature to actually get that extra converted mana cost to have your opponent pay in order to have that spell not to be countered. And I do like the idea here that spell is countered, it's exiled instead of going to the graveyard, so your opponent has no way of getting that spell back at any given point if they do have it in the graveyard. After that, we have Officious Interrogation. It's a 2 mana instant speed spell. This spell costs a double white and a blue extra more to cast for each target beyond the first. And then you choose any number of target players, investigate X times, where X is the number of creatures those players control. So this is quite interesting, right? At worst, it's a 2 mana. You investigate X times, and where X is the number of creatures that one player controls. If there's multiple players who have multiple creatures, and you want to target both of them, you pay 4 mana, so double white, double blue. This is really a cool card. I would say this is a card that's pretty okay, even paying 2 mana in just limited, right? Because in limited, you only have 1 player that you're playing against, more than likely, unless you're playing like a 2-headed giant. So 2 mana, investigate X times, so you get X clues, and you also, based on how many creatures they control, which can net you maybe 3-4 clues if you feel like you're behind on the battlefield. Those clues then turn into ways of maybe drawing additional cards, looking for more answers, or maybe turns on some other things that really care about you sacrificing said clues. In Constructed, maybe this will see some play. Just because if there's a deck that pops up that really cares about clues, or a blue-white control deck that wants to play this, it's a 2 mana, get X clues based on their battlefield. And then same thing with Commander. This is going to be a card that also shines in Commander because that's a multiplayer format. You're going to be able to pay 4 mana, maybe 6 mana, get a whole bunch of clues based on how many creatures all your opponents control if you decide to go the full maximum that you can spend on this. Overall, cool card. Definitely pretty solid that it scales as the game has more players. And I do think it initially starting at 2 mana makes it pretty approachable to even just get the effect for one target player and get X amount of clues out of that. So overall, pretty solid card, I would say, in this set. The next card up is going to be Private Eye. This is a 3 mana 3/3. Other detectives you control get +1/+1. And whenever you draw your second card each turn, target detective can't be blocked, which is overall pretty solid card. This is going to be the Detective Lord, so if you're playing the Detective archetype in your drafts and sealed, this is going to be a card you want to look out for, hopefully open up in your sealed pool. Overall, very strong card, I think. 3 mana for a 3/3 is always very good. Also, buffing your other things is also pretty solid. If you have 2 of these, they buff each other, so they both get bigger, and then they become 4/4s, which is definitely something that's much harder to deal with. Overall, really, really high on this card. This card is definitely very good. Definitely something I'm going to be looking out for if I'm playing that archetype. In terms of Constructed, if a detective deck pops up, this definitely probably be a card that's going to be included. I just don't know if there's enough, power to really compete with what other people are doing in Standard to be playing a detective themed deck. If there's enough to really get the game going. And then in terms of Commander, if a detective deck pops up, you'll probably have that one copy of this as to hopefully draw it in case of that idea of if I do get it out at some point, my detectives get much stronger. But overall, very, very good limited card when it comes terms of playing that detective archetype. After that, we have Rakdos, Patron of Chaos. This is a 6 mana 6/6 fly and trample creature. At the beginning of our end step, target opponent may sacrifice 2 non-land token permanents. If they don't, you draw 2 cards. This card is a bomb, right? This is like the big card. This is a card that you open this up, you draft this card, you are more than likely gonna have full advantage for the rest of the game, unless your opponent can deal with this. This card is going to probably more than likely net you 2 cards every end step, because your opponent's not going to want to sacrifice 2 non-land token permanents to keep you from drawing those 2 cards, especially if they're very important cards on their side of the battlefield. It having flying, it having trample, it costing 6 is definitely something that is very good. In terms of Constructed, maybe there's a deck that pops up. This is another very good solid top end, has built-in kind of removal-esque effect, because your opponent's going to may consider, it's like, do I really want to give them 2 additional cards after you're able to attack with it? Definitely a very strong card. And then in terms of Commander, same thing. It is a card that probably will see play in Commander. You can force an opponent who may not have a lot of things to maybe consider if they want to sacrifice those things and or let you draw 2 cards. So overall, very, very good card. Very highly sold on this card, and it is a limited bomb if you do open this card and or draft this card overall. Following that up, we have Rakish Scoundrel. It's a 4 mana 3/3 with Death Touch. When it enters the battlefield or is turned face up, target creature gains indestructible end of turn. You can turn it face down and flip it up for any time for 6 mana. This is kind of expensive. I think at best, this is really just a 4 mana 3/3 with Death Touch, which I think is already just very solid. If you're in a state where you feel like your opponent has a ton of removal, maybe you turn this face down and at some point flip it face up. But really, in all reality, I'd more than likely going to play this for the 4 mana 3/3 Death Touch side and just get the immediate effect of having a 3/3 Death Toucher on the battlefield. But still, nonetheless, it's not a bad card. It's definitely a good filler card, I think, at 4 for green-black. And I do think the idea here is does have the flexibility if you really think you're concerned about your opponent having some sort of removal, or there's a creature you don't want to lose by flipping this face up at instant speed. So definitely something to consider, but definitely I think more than likely most people will play this card as the 4 mana 3/3 Death Touch inside before they flip it face down and try to flip it face up as the game goes on. After that, we have a 7 mana card called Relive the Past. This is a sorcery. Return up to 1 target artifact, up to 1 target land, up to 1 target non-aura enchantment from the graveyard to the battlefield. They are 5/5 elemental creature in addition to their other types. This is kind of a unique card, I would say. This is definitely another weird top-end card overall for any sort of limited deck. It is 7 mana. It's quite expensive. Though I do think the idea here is you do get 15 power on the battlefield for that 7 mana if you are able to target 3 different things with the effect. It is kind of awkward, I would say, in limited, just because if you're not able to, it's just a really expensive spell to maybe get 1 or 2 5/5s, which is not always the greatest, but it's definitely not the worst thing. And then on top of that, you get those additional cards back onto the battlefield if they have any additional stack effects or any ETB effects. You get those as well. And then you have any of the other effects those cards would have on top of it. It is going to be something you probably see 1 or 2 copies in maybe a green-white deck that pops up in Constructed. Maybe this is just that weird top-end card just to kind of have some recursion from the graveyard to the battlefield. 1 or 2 copies just because 7 mana is quite a lot. And then in Commander, this is definitely a card that people will play if they're playing any of these card types in their decks. Just as a decent way to get those things back and also put pressure on the battlefield if there's some sort of board wipe, any sort of removal that eliminates a lot of things from the battlefield. This is like that card that kind of puts 3 things on the battlefield, and now all of a sudden that player has 3 power, 3 different creatures that are 5/5 power, and that is definitely going to put pressure on your other opponents to really deal with what is really happening. Plus, you have flexibility of playing much better, enchantments, artifacts, and lands that you want back on the battlefield to get that additional effect. So overall, pretty decent card. Definitely, I would say it's a little awkward for limited, but definitely not the worst thing you could be playing at 7 mana. But definitely not a bad card. It's definitely something that is probably more leaning towards like a commander deck style format than really just this a limited deck, just because of you really, to get full advantage of it, you want to have those card types in your graveyard. After that, we have Repulsive Mutation. This is an X green-blue spell. You put X +1/+1 counters on target creature you control, then counter up to 1 target spell unless the controller pays mana value equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. This card's also very good. It's another counter spell. It is flexible in the sense of you get to put +1/+1 counters on something if you want to. At worst, this is like a counter spell, and your opponent has to pay X based on whatever the strongest creature you have on the battlefield. So early in the game, if you have a 2/2 or a 3/3, your opponent has to pay 3 in addition. And if in a way you can kind of scale this, that you now target your 1 creature, put additional +1/+1 counter on it, 2/2/2 counters, depending on what the game state is and how much mana you have open. Or your opponent has open, you can kind of scale this based on, well, I have a 3/3 out, they have 5 mana open, I'm going to invest 3 additional mana into this, so that creature now becomes a 6/6, and now they don't have enough to pay for that, to resolve the spell. So it's definitely kind of one of those cards that we'll see a ton of play, I think, in Limited, just because you can scale it. It could see some play in Standard as well, in like constructed formats, just because of the flexibility to have your opponent have to pay based on your creatures on the battlefield. And then in terms of Commander, yet again, it's an okay-ish counter spell. I don't know if this is something people will play in green-blue card decks, but definitely has that flexibility to kind of, stop a spell at least based on what you have on the battlefield. So definitely something maybe to consider if you're looking for some sort of interaction type of stuff in Commander. But overall, it's a very, very good card, I would say, in general. After that, we have Rift Burst Helion. This is a 7 mana 6/7 with Reach. We can also flip it face down for 3 and then turn it face up at any point for 6. Overall, this is a very good card. It's a 6/7, has reach. It has the ability to be played for 7 or the ability to be face down and turn face up at any point for 6 mana. Overall, 6/7 is very good. This is probably the strongest creature we've seen, or the biggest creature we've seen, just because I think it's the only thing that has 7 toughness. I think the biggest thing we've seen could be a 6/6 or a 5/4. The 6/6 is kind of one of those things you have to put counters on it to make it a 6/6. But overall, this is a very good card. If you're in Gruul in Limited, this is going to be a card that's going to help you with your top end. Blocks very well with things in the air. Overall, very, very good card. After that, we have Rune Brand Juggler. It's a 2 mana 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, subspect up to 1 target creature you control. And then for 5 mana, sacrifice a suspected creature. Target creature gets -5 to end turn. This is an okay-ish card, right? It is one of those things that you do have to have a suspected creature to get the advantage of the secondary effect. But having the ability, if you have like a little small creature that you don't mind losing and suspecting it, is definitely not the worst thing. And then as the game goes on, you have a built-in method to essentially do -5/-5 to something, which could be very good. But worse, you at least have a 2/2 for 2, which is definitely not that bad. So it is kind of overall a decent card. Worst case scenario, if you play this out by itself, you have to suspect itself. So it does gain menace, though it can't block, so it's not going to become a very good blocker. But still, nonetheless, it is a very good solid 2-drop just to consider if you are in the Rakdos colors. The next card up is going to be Sanguine Savior. It's a 3 mana 2/1 flying lifelink. You can disguise it for white or black. And then turn it face up at any point. When this card is turned face up, another target creature you control gains lifelink in a turn. This is overall not a bad card. I do think the disguise effect is pretty okay. At worst, you have a 2/1 flyer lifelink that you just pay for 3, which is definitely not that bad either. Lifelink is always important. Gaining that additional couple life points could matter as the game goes on, just because those couple life points could matter towards the tail end of the game, because there's a possibility that is what saved you, allows you to win the game. Overall, not a bad card. Definitely an okay-ish filler card at 3 in black and white in Draft and Sealed. In terms of other formats, probably not really played, just because it's not really the strongest thing that could be played at 3 in these colors. But overall, not a bad limited card just to have as a filler. After that, we have Shady Informant. This is a 5 mana 4/2. When it dies, it deals 2 damage to any target. We can also turn it face down for 3 and flip it up at any point for 4. It's not a bad card. It's okay. It is kind of like a creature that has a built-in shock effect. You attack in with it kind of aggressively. Maybe you want your opponent to kind of kill it, so you can do two additional damage to any target. Your opponent's more than likely going to chump block it with at least a 2/2 to kill it in that process. So typically you're going to throw that 2 points of damage at your opponent's face. But if they have another creature that you want to also remove, this is kind of like a 2-for-1 spell. You know, you attack in with it aggressively. Your opponent blocks with a creature that kills this card, and then you get to target 2 points of damage somewhere else and maybe kill something else. Overall, not a bad card. Definitely a decent filler card. Definitely, kind of cool that it has a 4-mana flip effect, so it doesn't actually have to, be paid for the full 5 mana. You can set it up on turn 3, flip it up on turn 4. I guess it's up to you how flexible you really want to be with this card, but definitely not a bad card, I would say, as a 5-drop filler in Rakdos. Next, we have Soul Search. This is a 2-mana sorcery. Target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a non-land card from it. Exile that card. If that card's mana value is 1 or less, you create a 1/1 black spirit creature token with flying. This card's also very good. Being able to get an idea of what your opponent's doing, maybe what they have, maybe taking their early turn play is definitely something that is very possible if you're in black and white. In terms of limited, it's definitely something you probably have 1 or 2 copies of if you do end up with that many. Being able to take a look and get an idea of what your opponent may be doing for the next few turns is always a very good, advantage for you, just because you can kind of play around maybe certain things, or you at least have an idea maybe they don't have anything, and you can be as aggressive as you really want to. Upside here is if you get rid of a very small thing, you can get a 1/1 white-black creature token with flying, but more than likely you're going to take maybe one of their more powerful spells from their hand when you do this. Plus, that card is exiled, so that card's never going to really come back unless they have some sort of way to get cards back from exile. In terms of constructed, you'll probably see some play here and there because any sort of hand tate or any sort of way to get some information on what your opponent's doing is always very good. In terms of standard, this is actually probably not the worst thing you could be doing for black and white. But in other probably more older formats, like things that have things like Thoughtseize, Inquisition of Kozilek, those cards are just much better than this card. But in terms of standard, this may see some play here and there in these colors. And also, same thing goes for Commander. There's just much better ways to do hand tate if you're looking to do that type of effect at target opponent. And this is really just a one-person effect, so you're probably not playing it in a multiplayer format just because you only target one opponent. You don't get to target multiple opponents. So if anything, at least it's good hand tate in limited, and also can be hand tate for maybe more of a standard or Zov deck. The next card up is going to be Samala Sentry. This is a 2-mana 1/3 with reach. Whenever a face-down permanent we control is turned face up, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on it, and a +1/+1 counter on the Sentry. So this card overall is going to enable the disguise mechanic very well in your deck. It's a very synergistic card if that's what you're trying to do. At worst, this is a 1/3 for 2 mana that has reach, which is still very solid, blocks a lot of good things. Overall, very, very solid card. Definitely going to be one of those highlight cards from Limited that you're going to be playing if you're trying to do that particular mechanic. In terms of other formats, unless a deck pops up, I really don't see this card really seen play anywhere else, just because it really needs to be doing that sort of effect to really become a good card. Overall, not a bad card for Limited, but in terms of other formats, not really going to see tons of play in those formats. The next card up is going to be Tessa, Opulent Oligarch. It's a 3-mana 2/3 with Death Touch. At the beginning of our end step, investigate for each opponent who has lost life this turn. Whenever a clue you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you create a 1/1 white-black spirit creature token with flying, and that ability only triggers once each turn. So this is kind of a unique card, right? It's literally on the face, it is kind of a multiplayer card because it wants the ability to give the loss of life for each opponent, so it's definitely a card you'll see play in Commander because that's a format that has multiple players. If multiple players lost life, you'll then be able to investigate multiple times. It also can be a commander in Commander, so it's definitely good in that way. In terms of limited, it's still very good. I do think in the sense of being able to have consistent ways of investigating, generating clue tokens, and then be able to get cards out of those clue tokens by drawing a card and also getting a token is very solid. It itself having Death Touch makes it very hard to deal with in the sense that sometimes your opponent really doesn't want to block it because they don't want to maybe lose a creature that would normally kill it. Overall, it's not a bad card. And like I said, it will see probably a ton of play in Commander. It will see probably play in Limited. Constructed formats, maybe not as much. It's not the worst thing, but yet again, it is something that you really can't abuse because the triggers only happen once each turn. You're only playing against really one opponent in standard and stuff like that. But yet again, the effect is not the worst thing if you're really trying to play the clue mechanic. You want a way to investigate. There's a lot of ways to make your opponent lose life without really having to actually even attack them. And itself generates tokens that will be able to enable maybe some loss of life that way. Overall, not a bad card, but still definitely a card that will see tons of play in Commander and Limited. The next card up is going to be 10 Street Gossip. This is a 4-mana 4/4 Vigilance. You can tap it, add a green and red to your mana pool. You can only spend this mana to cast face down cards, so you can cast it to actually put a card face down, or you can spend that green and red and turn that card face up, which is actually overall not that bad. At worst, you have a 4/4 for 4 that also has Vigilance. And remember, turn of cards face up can happen at any time, so you can do this instant speed, you can do this on your opponent's turn, so overall having that flexibility to be able to attack, then kind of keep this card back as a blocker, and then maybe even tap and turn things face up, makes it very good. Overall, I'm very, very high on this card just because this set has a ton of cards that want to be disguised and turn face up. This is a card that's going to help you enable it, and itself also being a 4/4 makes it very good for limited. In terms of other formats, it's probably not the best thing. You're probably not going to really play this F4 in other formats like Constructed or Commander. But in terms of limited, this is another good card that helps you enable that disguise mechanic and use it as effectively as possible, having to really invest too much into turning the card face up. The next card up is going to be Tolzimir Midnight Light. It's a 5-mana 3/2 with lifelink. Whenever Tolzimir Midnight Light enters the battlefield, create a Vorja Fenstalker, a legendary 5/5 green wolf creature token with trample. Whenever a wolf you control attacks, if Tolzimir attacked this combat, target creature and opponent control blocks that wolf this turn if able. So basically, this is kind of a cool card. This is something, for 5 mana, you get a 3/2 with lifelink. You also get a 5/5. Pretty strong, I would say, overall. Definitely a good bomb card, I would say, in limited, just because it creates a lot of pressure on the battlefield very quickly. And then I guess its added upside is if your opponent maybe doesn't have a ton of blockers, you attack him with the wolf and Tolzimir. You force maybe their biggest creature to block the wolf, and then Tolzimir gets in for some free points of damage, also gains you a little bit of life. I think lifelink is pretty solid on this card. This is definitely going to be a good card in limited. In terms of constructed, it's definitely a little bit on the slower side, right? 5 mana is a lot. The format typically in standard and other formats are a little bit faster. Is there enough to really put pressure on the battlefield at this point of the game? Are you going to be alive still? And 2 toughness is not really anything that's hard to deal with, just because even a shot can deal with it. And then in terms of commander, this will probably be someone's commander. I would say it's definitely a good way to add white into maybe an elf deck, right? Because it's an elf scout. And I do think this is an overall pretty decent card for commander. You also maybe can build it up with other wolves. Definitely something that can work very well with Innistrad, Midnight Hunt, or Crimson Vow, just because there's a lot of werewolves and wolves in that set. Maybe there's a deck that pops up that's like Naya Wolves. But overall, it's not a bad card. Definitely something that's going to be seeing its highlights in limited, and then also see some play in commander. The next card up is going to be Treacherous Greed. This is a 3-mana instant speed spell. As additional cost to cast a spell, sacrifice a creature that dealt damage this turn. Draw 3 cards, each opponent loses 3 life, and you gain 3 life. So this card's quite unique, right? You can use it after your own combat, sacrifice one of your own creatures to draw 3 cards, and then make each opponent lose 3 life in that process. You can also cast it after you maybe block with a creature. Maybe you want to sacrifice that creature to then do this effect. Definitely a very unique card in that. Definitely not a bad card to have, I think, in limited, just because I do think that effect, even if it's an each opponent effect, is still very solid, even if it's just one opponent, right? You draw 3 cards, your opponent's going to lose 3 life, you're going to gain 3 life. I feel like it's a pretty solid effect. In multiplayer formats is where this card's going to shine, because each opponent's going to end up losing 3 life and you're going to gain 3 life. So overall, much better because you're going to hit more targets. But not bad to have. It's a very greedy card, right? It is Treacherous Greed. It is a greedy card. It is going to see, like I said, decent play in limited. Maybe not in constructed so much, just because do you really want to lose the card that you dealt damage with? I guess if you generate a bunch of tokens, maybe you're okay with losing a token. But this card's going to really shine in multiplayer formats like Commander. It's also going to be pretty decent to have in your more limited formats of Draft and Seal, just because drawing 3 cards for 3 mana is definitely not bad at the cost of losing a creature in the process. So overall, very, very good card. It's definitely quite strong, I would say, if you're able to consistently pull this off, but not a bad card to be looking out for if you're in white and black. After that, we have Tristani 3 Whispers. This is a 3-mana 4/4. Already pretty solid. I think any card that costs 3 and has more power than the casting cost is pretty good. And then it has a bunch of activated abilities. For 2 mana, we can give target creature Death Touch into end of turn. For 1 mana, either white or green, target creature gains Vigilance end of turn. And then for 3 mana, we can even give a creature Double Strike at end of turn. This card I am very high on. This is yet again another card that really turns the tide of battle into your favor, especially in limited, right? It is a 3-mana 4/4, which is already kind of a bomb. On top of that, you can then give this card various things depending on the way the game is going. So you can give this card Vigilance the following turn. You can also give it Death Touch. You can also give it Double Strike. Depending on how the game state is, you can just give it Vigilance and Double Strike every turn, and your opponent's like, well, crap, now I have to figure out how to deal with this card, because this card by itself is going to eventually kill your opponent. The idea of Double Strike makes this card really hard to deal with. I think the only downside to it is susceptible to spot removal, just because it is, there's no war, there's no protection on it. In terms of constructed, this card will probably see play because people see Mythic, people see a 4/4 for 3 mana, and they're like, I have to build a deck around it. This is something that can actually go underneath the Soul Cauldron and then make any creature you control with the +1/+1 counter on it gain these effects as well. So maybe the green-white Soul Cauldron activated ability style deck pops up. In terms of Commander, yet again, It's a 3 mana commander that's a 4/4. I'm sure people will play this as their commander. I'm sure people, if they're playing these colors, will play this in their deck. This is overall, I think, a very powerful card just because it has all these effects on it. It's just going to be a matter of if your opponent's going to give you any time to really cast them. And this card, yet again, is a bomb in limited, just because I think giving your cards these additional effects in like limited, sealed, and draft is definitely going to be very hard for your opponent to really deal with if they have no really good way of having good spot removal to really kill it that way. So overall, very, very strong card. Definitely something I would be looking out for. Definitely something I'm definitely playing in my sealeds and draft if I do see this card. And definitely something I'll probably mess around with in other formats like Standard and probably Commander as well. The next card up is Undercover Crocodile. It's a 6-mana 5/5. It's an elf crocodile detective. That's why it's a crocodile. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you investigate, and then you can disguise it for 3 and flip it face up for 5. Overall, pretty solid card, right? It's a possible 5-mana 5/5 that allows you to get additional clue tokens. Worst case scenario, you end up playing it as a 6-mana 5/5, which is still not that bad. But in the early game, you can set it up if you want to flip it over on turn 5. But overall, it's a very solid card. I think this card's another good, solid filler on the top end of a deck if you're looking for some strong things that do strong effects. This is actually not bad for a common, I think, overall. Definitely a cool card. Definitely kind of like a funny card that it is a card that has 3 different creature types on it, so if it's in any of those decks, if you're looking to add that into your deck. Overall, a cool card. Definitely a card that's going to shine in limited. I'm not really going to see play in most other formats just because I don't think paying 6 mana for a 5/5 is really the most effective thing to do if it doesn't have any other additional ETB effects, but definitely a cool card to be playing in limited. The next card up is going to be Urgent Necropsy. It's a 4-mana instant speed spell. As additional cost to cast this spell, collect evidence X, where X is the total mana value of permanents this spell targets. So you destroy up to 1 target artifact, up to 1 target creature, up to 1 target enchantment, and up to 1 target planeswalker. This card can be quite cheap to play. This card can be quite expensive to play, right? If you target a creature that's converted mana cost 3, so you already have to collect evidence 3. Target enchantment that maybe costs 4, that's 7. You target artifact that costs 1, that's 8. And then maybe target planeswalker that at minimum costs 4. You're already looking at collect evidence 12. Could be quite expensive to do multiple targets past the first. Overall, this is kind of a unique kind of, I would say, spell, just because it has the ability to be flexible. But you do have to have a bunch of converted mana costs in your graveyard really to have it be super effective. But still, nonetheless, it's not a bad card to have. It's not a really great card to have. It is kind of one of those things that may be a little awkward in limited, where you may not have a ton of converted mana costs to really do multiple things. It may be just like, hey, I'm going to cast this and deal with your 1 creature and exile things based on that converted mana cost of said 1 creature. But overall, it's not a bad card. It's something that probably will only see play really in limited when you open it up. It's also something I'll probably see playing Commander, just because there are decks that will self-mill themselves and have abilities to pay that additional X and be able to target multiple things and actually deal with multiple things on the battlefield. In terms of constructed, I don't think this is a spell I'm going to be playing at 4, just because I do think having to exile that many things based on the converted mana cost is going to be a little bit too expensive. But in limited and Commander is probably where you're going to see play with this card. It'll probably just turn into like a bulk rare at some point, or bulk mythic, I should say, because I don't think this card's going to be overpowerful that you're going to be able to take real advantage of it and really exile destroy a bunch of like things based on the ability of having to collect that evidence based on the converted mana cost. After that, we have Vanifar the Involved Enigma. It's a 4-mana 3/4. At the beginning of combat during our turn, we choose one. We either cloak a card from our hand, so we put that card on the battlefield face down. It becomes a creature with Ward 2. Turn of face time at any time for its mana cost. So it's kind of like almost like, hey, I want to put this card for free out on the battlefield, and at some point I'll turn it face up. Or we get to put a +1/+1 counter on each colorless creature you control. So I believe that also targets the face down cards, right? Because the face down cards are colorless creatures. I don't think they're actually a color creature, so that actually is able to buff your creatures that are face down. So overall, it's not a bad card. It's definitely a good card. It's definitely something I would consider playing definitely in my drafts and sealed. It's probably something I could play around with Commander. As terms of maybe a more constructed format, it does seem a little bit more awkward. It is something that if your opponent has some sort of way to deal with your little 2/2 Ward 2 guys on the battlefield, you're not going to get full advantage of turning them face up at any point. Though I do like the idea here that you do have a good way of buffing your creatures on the battlefield, making your 2/2s that much harder to deal with if they're not able to be dealt with. But overall, it's not a bad card. It's pretty decent. It is, like I said, probably going to really see play in Commander. It's going to be a good card to be playing in your limited drafts and sealed, just because I do think if your opponent's doesn't have any sort of board wipe, they're not going to be able to deal with these cloaked cards on the battlefield, and they're just going to get bigger and bigger each combat as you kind of gain the secondary effect of this card. And it itself is a 3/4, which is also pretty solid. So overall, pretty cool card to be messing around with that face down mechanic. After that, we have War Leader's Call. This is a 3-mana enchantment. Gives your creatures +1/+1. Whenever enchanted creature enters the battlefield under your control, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. This is a cool card, right? This is a good card. It does a lot. Because it doesn't, it buffs your creatures, and on top of that, it also punishes your opponent every time you play a creature going forward. So even if you don't have any creatures, any creature you play going forward after this enchantment, if they're going to get pinged for 1 point of damage no matter what. If you have ways of generating additional tokens, this is going to be a card that's going to deal a lot of points of damage, I think, fairly quickly. I think this is definitely going to be a card being played in multiple formats, just because I do think there's many ways of taking advantage of putting a bunch of creatures onto the battlefield. In Limited, it's definitely a very strong card. I'm definitely playing this card. If I'm playing Boros, I open it or draft it. In Constructed, I do think you could build, I think the Pia deck could probably add a couple copies of this, and that deck itself could probably put out a bunch of creatures out in one turn, which in theory, they'll each deal 1 point of damage to your opponent's face, so it then becomes almost like a machine gun effect. You put 4 tokens out, all of a sudden they deal 4 points of damage to your opponent. In a commander format, same thing. You are able to pump out a bunch of tokens very quickly. 1, your creatures all get buffed. 2, then each opponent's going to get almost machine gunned down, and they're not going to be able to deal with this card. Overall, a very, very good card. Very, very flexible. I think this is kind of like a card that I think if I'm going to be investing the mana in, this is something I'm going to want, because it not just has a static board effect, it has an additional effect for anything that comes out after it. So definitely a very, very good card, no matter what format you decide to play this card in. The next card up is going to be Wisp Drinker Vampire. This is a 4-mana 2/4 flyer. Whenever another creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under our control, each opponent loses 1 life and we gain 1 life. Pretty good effect, I think, in general. Targets multiple opponents if you're in a multiplayer game. Worst case scenario, you're just targeting your one opponent in your limited draft when you play this card. And then for 7 mana, you can have creatures you control with power 2 or less gain Death Touch and lifelink that in turn, turning your little small creatures into very aggressive creatures that your opponent's going to have to consider if they really want to block them, and what they're going to block and what creatures they're going to lose in that process, and then netting you a whole bunch of life in that process. Overall, a very, very good card. If you're playing a very low-to-the-ground kind of creature-style deck where you're playing a lot of small creatures, this is a very good card to have. If you're in Orzhov or you create a bunch of tokens, definitely a cool card. Definitely a card that's going to be really played in Limited just as a way to kind of put pressure on your opponent as the game goes on. Overall, not that bad. I would say in other formats, it's not really playable. 4 mana is a lot for only a 2/4. And also 7 mana is also a lot to get that additional effect. Plus, to build around like a 2 power or less deck is really tough, just because you want to play more powerful things, because you're more than likely in other formats your opponent's going to also be playing a bunch of strong things in general. But still, like I said, not a bad card to be considering when it comes to Limited for draft and sealed. After that, we have World Soul's Rage. This is a X green-red spell. That's a sorcery. It deals X damage to any target. Put up to X land cards from our hand and or graveyard onto the battlefield tapped. This is kind of a cool card in the sense of that it's a card that deals damage to something. It could deal damage to your opponent's face, which is pretty cool. And then if any land cards went to the graveyard for some reason through the course of the game, they come onto the battlefield tapped, and they also come from your hand. So it's like there's always situations where you have those cards that put cards, you can play additional lands from your hand onto the battlefield, but you don't have any lands. They're in the graveyard. This is kind of those cards that gives you flexibility. If things went in the graveyard, you can then return them to the battlefields, which is definitely pretty sweet. They do come into play taps, so if they're fetch lands or anything like that, they're not going to be able to be immediately cracked to be fetched. It is sorcery speed, so you do have to wait a whole turn in order to take advantage of having those additional lands. But still, nonetheless, is definitely a good card. It is something that's probably a little bit more awkward, I would say, in Limited, but being able to ramp up even on turn 3 or turn 4 with this card could be pretty good. It's also used as spot removal or damage to your opponent's face, maybe to finish them off as the game goes on. So even if you draw it on turn 7, you pay 5 mana into this, you can deal 5 damage to your opponent's face, and then put up to 5 lands from your graveyard and or battlefield onto the battlefield tap, which isn't the worst thing, I would say, overall. Definitely a good card. In terms of Constructed, maybe this card sees some play here and there. It's a little bit of a heavy investment. Typically, a lot of green-red decks want to play a lot of creatures, be very low to the ground. Don't really want to be playing really expensive spells. In terms of Commander, this is probably a card people will play if they're into green-red. A lot of those decks want to ramp up. This is a card that allows them to recur maybe any of their fetch lands, or if any lands went to the graveyard at any point of the game, this is a way to get those back onto the battlefield pretty effectively, and typically they have a lot of mana to invest into X a lot, so it's definitely something that is definitely playable that way. But overall, this is a very solid card in draft and probably also in Commander. The next card up is going to be Yaris, Roar of the Old Gods. This is a 4-mana 4/4. It gives your other creatures haste. Whenever one or more face down creatures you control or deal combat damage to a player, you get to draw a card. Pretty solid. Whenever face down creature card you control dies, return to the battlefield face down under its owner's control. If it's a permanent card, then turn it face up. This is actually a pretty solid card, right? This is a card that allows you to recur any face down cards, allows you to be aggressive with your face down cards, allows you to return them to the battlefield face down and then flip it face up if it's a permanent. So definitely overall pretty solid card. This is definitely very strong, I think, for 4. Definitely something if you open this and you're drafting sealed, you're going to be playing it. I would say this is like a way to be like, I'm definitely playing these colors. This is like an enabler for that effect, and definitely like as you draw this, you'll be like, well, I now have to get this guy's cards to take full advantage of this. So overall, very, very good card. In terms of constructed formats, if face down cards become like a thing that people play, then this is a card that you're going to be playing alongside of them to make them that much stronger. It allows you to have them have some sort of way to prevent them from literally leaving the battlefield just because they're going to turn back onto the battlefield at if they do die. So definitely cool there. And in terms of commander, yet again, if someone builds around the face down mechanic and turn it face up, this is definitely a good card to have as it's a good enabler. It could be your commander. It could be in your green-red deck that kind of plays along with the whole effect. In Commander, there's also the Morph ability, which is very similar to the whole disguise mechanic. Morph is a thing from an older format. It's definitely something that you could consider to be playing alongside this card. Definitely a good card, I think, overall in general to be playing if that's the archetype you're trying to go for. But this card will definitely shine in Limited just because there are a lot of cards that have disguise, and this is going to be a card that helps and takes advantage of said cards that have disguise. Well, next card up is a Sideways card, so it is a two-way card. I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to turn it, but exile up to 2 target cards from a single graveyard. Target player gains 2 life and draws a card. So for 2 mana, you get to cease, and then for 6 mana, you can desist, which destroys all artifacts and enchantments. So it does have like flexibility. The downside is it does require you to be playing probably green to actually really take full advantage of this, and then probably splash either one of the other colors. But, you know, it's definitely not a bad card. I definitely think this is something, depending on how the game is going. Maybe there's cards in the graveyard you don't want your opponent to get. You get a little bit of card draw out of it, gain a little bit of life on the 2 mana side. If your opponent's playing a ton of artifacts and or enchantments, you pay 6 mana, wipe the battlefield of all of them. Definitely something that's going to be more so played in Limited, probably not played in really any other format, as I do think this is probably not super effective. In that sense, it could be maybe something that is a sideboard card at best just because it has that flexibility. I guess if you think you're going to be playing against the enchantment matchup in maybe like a standard, maybe you want that six mana other side of it just because it is something that can destroy that battlefield, though you do have to be locked into either white, green, or black to actually cast a spell to fully take advantage of it. But still, nonetheless, not a bad card to have. After that, we have Flotsam and Jetsam. This is, I guess, a play on words for the Little Mermaid. It is a 2-mana instant speed spell that mills 3 cards and investigate. So something if you're trying to self-mill, this is going to be the first side. The 2-mana side is going to be a self-mill effect. And then the second side is each opponent mills 3 cards. Then you may cast a spell from each opponent's graveyard without paying its mana cost. If a spell be cast this way would be put into a graveyard, exile instead. So definitely has some flexibility. Yet again, it's a card that you're going to want to have some blue for. It's definitely focused on blue, and then you splash either of the other 2 colors. Definitely not bad, I would say, overall. I think the Jetsam effect is definitely very good in multiplayer games, even in like a 2-mana giant. Could even see some play here in like like maybe like more of a commander deck. For terms of constructed, probably not the best. And then I would say even in Limited, it's kind of a little bit awkward, right? It is something that maybe you want to self-mill yourself. Maybe you have some collect evidence cards. You want to get some cards in the graveyard, get a clue going. The 2-mana side's okay in that way. The Jetsam maybe will hit something from your opponent's library, but you're only be able to target really one opponent. So it's definitely something that we'll see some play here and there, and maybe a deck that wants to take advantage of the 6-mana side in maybe a multiplayer game format for the most part. After that, we have Fuss and Bother. The Fuss side is put a +1/+1 counter on each attacking creature you control. And then Bother is create 3 1/1 colorless adopted creature tokens with Flying and Surveil 2. This card's not bad, right? I think this card's actually probably so far out of all of them is stronger on the Fuss side. I do think that is kind of like a decent combat enabler, right? You attacking aggressively. You have this combat trick. Now giving all your creatures that additional +1/+1, making it much trickier for your opponent to really block effectively. They put their blocks. They think they're going to trade very well. And then all of a sudden it's like, boom, all of a sudden these cards have additional +1/+1. It's like, well, now we're trading pretty evenly, which is pretty sweet. The Bother is okay. It's not anything special. It is sorcery speed, so it's a bit slow. It is something that you only get 1/1 tokens, which don't seem very effective, right? You're not getting like a bunch of them. You're only getting 3 for 6 mana. and I guess you surveil too, but I really would say if you're in that Boros style deck, you'd be playing this card because that fuss is actually another good way to finish off your opponent or attack aggressively against an opponent. The next card up is another two-sided card. It is Hustle and Bustle. Hustle is target creature attacks or blocks if able, so you force an opponent to attack and or block with a creature maybe they don't want to. And then Bustle is a 6 mana. Creatures you control get trample and +2/+2 until end of turn, and then you may turn a creature you control face up. I actually really like Bustle. Yet again, Bustle is another good solid way to attack and aggressively if you're playing in that color scheme. If you're playing Gruul, you'll definitely be able to cast that side. I do like the idea as well. It's like, hey, maybe you have a good strong face down card. That's like maybe when it turns face up is like a 6/6. You turn it face up as well on top of that. All of a sudden you're attacking him for like a big point of damage. You're overrunning your opponent, and all of a sudden you pretty much win the game right then and there. This is a very good 6 mana card, I think, in limited for that regard. In terms of other formats, not really the most craziest thing. I don't think either of them really stand out on their own in those other formats. But for limited, definitely the 6 mana side is going to be very good, especially if you're in green and red for the most part. After that, we have Push and Pull. Push is going to be destroy target tap creature, so you have removal on the 2 mana side at sorcery speed. And then you have Pull here, which is also sorcery. You put up to 2 target creature cards from a single graveyard onto the battlefield under our control. They gain haste on a turn, and then you sacrifice them at the beginning of the next end step. So basically, if you could take your opponent's strong things, you take things back from your graveyard, put them on the battlefield, and then attack aggressively in one of them. Yet again, the 6 mana side seems like to be like a finisher. You're going to probably cast that if you think you can kind of almost kill your opponent or make them have to make really bad blocks in the sense they're going to lose a lot of stuff by doing the pull side. Push is okay too. If you're lacking removal, it's like an okay flexible removal spell just because of the effect of it being able to destroy target tap creature. But if your opponent has any sort of way to keep creatures on tap, like Vigilance, it's definitely going to be a very frustrating kind of removal spell because you'd be like, come on, just tap that creature. Come on, you just tap it and I can, cast this. So it's definitely kind of like slow in that regard. Also, it's sorcery speed, so it's not a 2 mana removal spell. Once they tap it to attack, you have to kind of either absorb that attack if they decide to tap down a creature and then deal with that creature during your turn. So definitely kind of mostly a limited card. I think the pull side is probably the better side yet again of this card just because I do think that sets you up to actually maybe try to finish off your opponent or make your opponent make some bad blocks. Overall, pretty solid card, I would say, for limited. And mostly the pull side is the side that shines. And that is it for the multicolor cards for Murders at Karlov Manor. There are quite a few. There are a lot of things I like from these cards that we've seen just because there are a lot of cards that make some of the mechanics of the set seem a little bit clearer, seem a little bit better. There are some cards that definitely stood out from this. If there are any that stood out to you, let me know in the comments below. If you want to watch me do these live, I try to do these during my live stream on twitch.tv/thescartv. If you want to check me out there, I stream 3 nights a week. So if you want to give me a follow, I'll have a link down in the description below. And then you can see me when I go live on Twitch. With that being said, if you like the video, hit that like button. Definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, you want to know when I post new videos like this one on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But until next time, I will see you in the next video.